Okay, in my completion nearing book titled Writing Beyond Realism, Ishikawa Jun and the Case Against Modern Japanese Literature, a critical study of Ishikawa's early fiction and essays with translations. In that book I have a chapter, I have a chapter called, what's the title of the chapter? Ishikawa's Genealogy of Modern Japanese Literature and Apophatic Theory of the True Shosetsu, chapter 6 of the book, in which I discuss Ishikawa's sort of revisionist account of modern Japanese literature, and I use the word apophatic, which is describing a phenomenon by sort of describing what that phenomenon is not, and that's the word I use to describe Ishikawa's theory of the Shosetsu. He argues that the Shosetsu cannot be described or defined in positive or explicit terms and has to be defined in a negative way, right? By describing what it is not, and that's what he does in an essay that I analyzed in that chapter. And in that chapter, in Ishikawa's essay rather, he talks about modern Japanese literature, and he gives a very sort of negative critique or negative account of it. And he says basically that most of the so-called novels or shosetsu from the Meiji period on are in fact not shosetsu at all, but rather sort of derivations of the ninjōbon, which appeared in the early 19th century, and that there are only a few instances of true shosetsu in the modern period, right? And two of the examples that he gives of true shosetsu are Mori Ōgai's Tsuina, which John Dower translated as Exorcising Demons, and the work, I think Dower's translation came out in 1970, I think. It's available on JSTOR, and I have the link provided in the description here. Tsuina, Exorcising Demons in Dower's translation. You can also translate the word Tsuina as night thoughts. Okay, I'm going to read Dower's translation of that work. And the other work that Ishikawa describes as one of the few instances of a true shosetsu in the modern period is Nagai Kafe's Shotaku. And I will discuss that work, written in 1912, published in 1912, in another video. For this video I want to focus on Tsuina and give a recitation of Tsuina. And as we read this, we will want to consider, I'll make a study guide for this later, but as we read it and listen to my recitation of it now, let's consider what qualities the work has that Ishikawa thought qualify the work as a true shosetsu, rather than the many inauthentic or sort of spurious shosetsu that exist in the Meiji and Taishō periods. What is different about this work, right? And remember that Ishikawa's critique of the existing so-called shosetsu is that they first are derivations of the ninjōbon, that genre of licentious fictions, as what's his name, Pound, I think, calls it in his recent book, and also that they come from the idea that was imported in the early Meiji period, that the word in Japanese is shajitsu, or tracing from reality, tracing from actuality. In short, mimetic naturalistic mimesis, or mimetic realism, right? So Ishikawa in his book argues that naturalistic mimesis becomes sort of the bedrock notion for all of modern Japanese literature, and because that, insofar as that is the bedrock foundational notion of Japanese literature, modern writers have not, in general, written any true shosetsu. But he gives these two exceptions. I think he might have another few exceptions in his mind when he's writing his essay, but these are the two that he actually cites, right? So let's consider, as we read this, what is different about this work when compared with all the other sort of more realistic or naturalistic or shizen shugi shosetsu that are written in the modern period. Okay, so here is John Dower's translation of Tsuina. Now I'll read the work in full. Keep in mind that Ishikawa calls it one of the first authentic shosetsu in Japan, despite the fact that it's only 4 or 5 pages. So length is not an essential quality for true shosetsu in Ishikawa's opinion. Alright, Tsuina by Mori Ōgai. There is a saying in the West that if you give the devil a single hair, without fail he will depart with your soul. It makes no difference whether a person is labeled innocuously as a chap who doesn't write, or spitefully as one who can't write. Either way, he has peace and quiet. There's not really a great deal of difference between these two labels. As it happens, however, people do write. For example, they may write for the innocent, childish, and entirely sentimental reason that they feel moved to do so. Well, once it is said that someone writes, he is called upon to write from every direction. And how and what to write? I am exhausted when I return home from the government office. People usually have a drink at dinner, and then cheerfully go to sleep until the next morning. But I turn the lamp low and sleep for just a while, with the resolution of getting up shortly. At midnight I wake up. My mind is a little recovered. I stay up from then until 2 o'clock and write. Thoughts of the day are different from those of the night. It often happens that during the night I believe I have satisfactorily solved a problem I couldn't solve during the day, but when I reappraise this the next morning, it frequently turns out to be no solution at all. There is something unreliable about the thoughts of the night. Among literary people, there are those such as Balzac who work at night. Lassalle, his sometime collaborator, was obliged to sleep in the early morning, and then roused at 1 o'clock in the morning. Early evening, rather. To sleep in the early evening and then roused at 1 o'clock in the morning. You still haven't broken your bad habit of sleeping during the night, Balzac is said to have told him. The night is for work, so here's coffee. Drink this, he said, and wake up and get to work. White paper was stacked on the table. Balzac, wearing his famous robe, dictated while pacing back and forth in the room. It is said that Lassalle was forced to transcribe what was said until 7 o'clock in the morning. But Balzac didn't have to take care of government business from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. When I think about this, my thoughts of the night seem even more unreliable. Be that as it may, I sit at my desk, take pen in hand, and consider what to write. In writing prose, we are told we should write about certain things in a certain way. Moreover, any creative work other than lyric poetry and drama seems to be conceived of as some sort of literary prose. There are no such specifications in drama, but that appears to be because drama has been ignored anyway. The injunction that one must write about certain things in a certain way is expounded as if it were a new invention. Thus it becomes almost a death sentence if a chap is accused of having retained the same style he used 10 years ago. Should it really be this way? Stendhal died in 1842. I wonder whether the things he wrote would ideally fulfill the requirements of these contemporaries who call for writing about certain things in a certain way. If you take the view that everything in the world changes, then it is unchanging unceasingly at every moment. If, however, you take the view that there is no change, then you have eternal immutability. Recently, words such as shackled and liberated have become fashionable, but strictly speaking, isn't it a very shackled notion to insist that one should write literary prose about certain things in a certain way? I, with my thoughts in the night, have concluded that what we call literary prose may be written about anything and in any style. In a celebration such as Carnival, each year the elected king is paraded about, and when this festival is done, he is cast aside without a second thought. Should this be the case also in a history of true literary development? Who was last year's king? Who is this year's king? When you think about it, people who want to cry certainly have something to cry about, but at the same time, those who want to laugh have adequate reason to do so. Isn't that so? I have written something supercilious. I didn't intend to write such a thing, but so be it. Since I've already put it down, let it stand as is. Strindberg has a play called The Dance in the Dead Man. As the curtain rises, the protagonist, a man named Edgar, is stricken by a heart attack and appears to be dead. His wife is delighted. Before the final curtain closes, he suffers a second stroke and does indeed die. Following his first death, Edgar seeks after fame. He wallows in greed. This does not cease until his real death. This is the dance of the dead man. If you ask me to write things, isn't that like asking a dead man to dance? I just had an idea and wrote Shinki-raku, where I had left space for the title of this piece. This struck me as a title which would have a certain magnetism when it was advertised. Nowadays, if you wish to attract attention when writing, it seems necessary to wear a slight tinge of scandal. On the other hand, there is a matter of this magazine's reputation. When I took this into consideration, I struck out the 3 ideographs for Shinki-raku and wrote the present title beside them. Tsuina. This will be taken a little more seriously. I think I'd like to tell about the bean scattering ceremony which took place at the Shinki-raku restaurant in Tokyo's Tsukiji district. That I am able to relate this story to you now is due to the favor of Mr. M.F. I thought of writing dedicated to M.F. following the title. Since books are dedicated, why shouldn't it be all right to do this also with pieces written for magazines? Don't we often find rights of translation reserved, reprinting prohibited, etc. in magazines also? I refrain from this, however, out of pity for those gentlemen of the press who have resolved to employ only solemn expressions in describing me. Mr. M.F. is a man whom I had met 2 or 3 times at literary gatherings. He invited me to Shinki-raku at 6 p.m. last February 3rd. There was a postscript on the printed invitation saying that I should come back because so-and-so had also been invited. I need not add that, since it was me they were addressing, this certain so-and-so was not a woman. The government office closed at 4 o'clock. I removed the documents with which I had been working from the table, placed them in the cabinet for confidential papers, and locked it. I put on my hat, fastened my sword, donned my cloak. I felt more animated than usual. The days on which I return directly home are rare. There are many dinner parties, and on some days I neglect 2 places to go to a third. The places I usually go to are all of a kind. Places such as Kaikōsha, Fujimiken, Yaokan, Kogetsu, the Imperial Hotel Seiyoken, etc. A step down from these, there are places like Takarate and Fujimiro. The Shinki-raku, however, is a rarity. Occasionally I go to such places as Tokiwa, Kotokiwa, and Hisagoya. But the Shinki-raku was a completely unfamiliar word. I anticipated that going to the Shinki-raku would be like opening a door leading to a completely unknown place. Alright, so underline that, it's an important word. And keep in mind as you read this that he's talking about this Shinki-raku and this act of writing late at night, or whatever thoughts happen to come to his mind, as a kind of metaphor for what the novel, what the shōsetsu should be and can be, right? So he's sort of implicitly positing a radically new conception of the novel in this seemingly boring, meandering work, right? Keep that in mind as you read. Continuing. It was not that I thought there would be attractive women at this Shinki-raku. When I look at the novels of the contemporary school of naturalism, Shizen Shugi, the fantasies of the authors are always dominated by women, but I think that is just because of their youth. Okay, you'll remember that Mori Ōgai wrote his famous novel Vita Sexualis, which we've discussed and read in this class, and I have a video on that work as well. And he's sort of a critic of Shizen Shugi, of works that simply outline the desires of the mostly sexual desires of the author/protagonists. Okay, continuing. That is just because of their youth. When one is close to 50, as I am, sexual desires do not constitute the major part of his life. I'm not saying this just for appearance. What is the use of pretending? Alright, so he's basically saying that literature should be something more than simply the descriptions of youthful sexual desire and lust and so forth. Continuing, it was only the fact that this was an unknown world that stimulated me. An unknown world, underline that, right? This opening into an unknown world is what the novel should be, in his view. That stimulated me. To give an example, it was like the feeling when one takes a penknife and cuts the pages of a book which he has never read before. I left the office and got on a streetcar. Fine rain fell intermittently from a grey sky. I had provided myself with a book to read on the streetcar, but it is seldom possible to read on the tram after 4 o'clock. I got off in front of Honganji Temple. Assuming this to be the general neighborhood, I headed in the direction of the moat, glancing at door after door as I passed by. There was a nameplate reading Horikoshi on a tidy house. We had met 2 or 3 times, and I thought, so this is where he lives. I zigzagged along, taking care not to muddy my boots. At last I found the Shinkiraku. It was a house on the corner where the street joined the road running along the side of the moat. In front of the lattice door I looked at my watch, ridiculously early. Since it was just 4:30, there remained an hour and a half before the engagement. I entered the lattice door. The concrete floor inside had been freshly washed, and my muddy boots left an imprint. It irritated me. I apologized for arriving too early and was led to the second floor. It was a large corner room with no veranda, which faced both east and south. On the west side was a tokonoma, and the north led to a stairway from the kitchen. I seated myself in the southern corner, intending to wait patiently until the time came. The house was new. The tatami were new. There was not a single cigarette burn on the tatami, and I wondered if the guests who came here were especially well behaved. In any case, it was a pleasant atmosphere. The maid brought in tea and cake. I liked the fact that she left without laughing or saying anything unnecessary. Her kimono, too, was a subdued color. I recall the 2 groups in the student dormitory in Mori Ōgai's novel Vita Sexualis. On the one hand, you have the nampa, the sort of wild, boisterous playboy types who hang around with women. It's called the nampa. They're sort of effeminate in manner. And then on the other hand, you have the koha, or the sort of more austere, studious Confucian young types who prefer studying and reading Chinese literature and hanging out among themselves in a very homosocial environment with just boys and sort of look down on girls and say misogynist things from time to time. That's the Koha group in Mori Ōgai, or at least the protagonist and narrator in that novel is very much aligned with the Koha camp. And you can see in this short work here too, the narrator is very much a Koha rather than a Nampa type. So keep that in mind whenever you read the works of Mori Ōgai. Where were we? I liked the fact that she laughed. The woman, the maid, came in, didn't say anything unnecessary and left. And he likes that. Her kimono too was a subdued color. I drank the tea and ate the cake and then leafed through the book which I had brought, but did not feel like reading. I took out a cigar, bit off the end, and lit it by pushing the tip against the piece of charcoal in the brazier. All around me it was hushed. The sound of rain clogs rose from the street by the moat. Built into the high and massive sliding doors by which I sat, at about the height of my elbow, there were 2 small movable panels. I opened one and looked out, but there was no one to be seen. Apparently he had turned into a side street, and everything had become grey. Even the gaudy new Naval Memorial Museum appeared as if brushed over with grey. A solitary auto with no rider but the driver came from the direction of the naval school and slowly made its way west. I closed the panel. The lights came on. I smoked my cigar and looked around the room. In this large, airy, attractive room, I thought, nothing impedes the eye. There are no disagreeable hangings on the wall. Despite the inclusion of that inevitable relic, the tokonoma, the kakemono, and flower arrangement are hardly conspicuous. It is a most suitable place to sit and eat delectable things and watch the geisha perform. One might say that this is Japan's architecture in these materialistic times. A door opened in the northwest corner, diagonal to where I was sitting, and someone entered the room. It was a little shriveled old lady, white hairs pulled back side by side and fastened in a bun. She wore a red sleeveless coat. Tucked into the crook of her left arm was a container, and without a moment's delay she walked into the very center of the room. Without kneeling down, she bowed to me in greeting, touching just the fingertips of her right hand to the floor. I stared at her in mute astonishment. In with fortune, out with demons. The old woman began to scatter beans. The door on the north side opened and several maids flocked in and picked up the beans which had been scattered. The old woman's manner was thoroughly lively and infectious. I perceived without asking that she was the mistress of the Shinkiraku. In Nietzsche, there is a passage concerning the twilight of art. Art is most deeply felt when the spell of death pervades it, as when people who have become old think back on the time of their youth and celebrate anniversaries. In southern Italy, there are people who hold a Greek festival once a year. The best things within us may be an inheritance of the sensibilities of an ancient time. The sun has already set. The heaven of our lives is lighted by the lingering glow of a sun which has already passed from sight. Art is not alone in this. It is the same with things like religion and morality. After a while, M.F. arrived. He was wearing a western suit as usual and chatted with his right hand resting on the tatami mat, on the tatami behind him, and body leaning to one side. Somehow he invariably gives the impression of being a person who, as the saying goes, feasts on mermaids. I told him of the bean scattering. Is that so? That's interesting. I shall have to make them do it again after the others have arrived. Eventually the others came, all of them fat and prosperous. Carefully selected geisha flocked in and seemed to outnumber the guests. The repetition of the bean scattering ended without attracting much attention. And that is the story. Let me add a bit more, however, to give the critics an opportunity to reinforce their accusations of pedantry. The ceremony of exorcising demons originated long ago, but the scattering of beans probably came about after the Kamakura period. Interestingly, a similar custom was practiced in Rome. The Romans called dead souls lemur, and held a ceremony to drive them away at midnight, sometime during May. During that ritual, they threw black beans behind themselves. In Japan, we originally threw the beans behind us, but later changed to throwing them in front. Okay, that's the end of the story. Those of you who are familiar with Japan to some degree will know that this is a reference. The story refers to the custom of setsubun, or it's called in this story Tsuina, right? But it means the same thing as setsubun, namely the ritual to exorcise the evil spirits on the last day of winter. Okay, So spring begins the following day, and this is the day when you get rid of all the evil spirits that had accumulated around you during the winter, and you throw them away. And it has its origins in Chinese Nuo performer. You can look, I'll have a note on the study guide about all this stuff, but keep in mind it's associated with Setsubun, and the practice is sometimes called mame maki, or bean scattering, and it first appeared, Mori Ōgai narrator at the end of the story says Kamakura, I think, but according to this encyclopedia, Muromachi period is when mame maki begins, and it's usually performed by the toshi otoko of the household, the man who was born on the corresponding animal year, the man of the house basically. And they throw roasted soybeans, right, either out the door or at a member of the family who's wearing the oni mask, right, who personifies all the evil spirits, and they throw the beans at them, and they yell at him, "Oni wa soto, fuku wa uchi." Okay, the demons, get out of the house, get away from us, and fuku, or prosperity, or luck rather, come inside and be with us, is the practice. It's still observed today by the Japanese. You can see them do it every year at the end of winter. The beans are thought to symbolically purify the home and send away the evil spirits. Okay. Alright, so I will make a study guide for this work. Very short work, not too complicated, but there's a lot of stuff to discuss in it. Alright, that is all for now. Goodbye.